When you see preprints, think pre-peer review. And so peer review is the process in which traditional science papers go through, in which the paper is submitted to an editor of a journal, and then that editor will say, this probably might be okay for our journal, but I'm not sure. Let me send it off to various peer reviewers, which are colleagues in the field of the authors of the paper, because these people know this field better than I do, and I want to get multiple opinions. So then they're going to contact those peer reviewers, or potential peer reviewers at this point. And they say, would you be willing to review this paper? And they'll give you an abstract saying, this is what this paper is about. Does this sound like something that you feel confident reviewing, and you have time to review it? And if the reviewer says yes, they'll be like, great, and send them the paper and be like, yes, feedback in 14 days. And then the reviewer is going to get the paper and the associated files, and they're going to read it over, and they're going to answer some questions, whether it's appropriate, whether it's rigorous, all this stuff. There's some short answers, typically, things that they want the authors to address. And so that's a big part, is like, okay, I have these questions about your paper. Can you explain why you did this way? Did you try this? This isn't very conclusive. This claim is too strong for you to make based on your data. Why don't you do this follow-up experiment? And if that confirms things, then you can say that. Or maybe that's too speculative, and that sort of thing. And so then these peer reviewers are going to give that feedback back to the editor. And then the editor is going to collect that feedback and give it back to the authors. The editor is going to be like, okay, this is accepted as is, which is very rare, or it's accepted with revisions, minor revisions, so just change these small little things, and then we're pretty sure that you can get this published in our journal. You might also get major revisions needed, and so in this case there might be multiple follow-up experiments or something. The peer reviewers and the editor don't feel confident in the paper quite yet, but they do think that it is appropriate for the journal, and that with those additional data they could be better and it could be able to be published. Or the editor might be like, this is just not appropriate for this journal. And so if the editor initially is saying it's not appropriate for this journal, it's not even going to peer review. And so the authors find out quickly, and they're like, okay, I'll just send it to another journal. However, if the peer reviewers are then like, this isn't good enough for this journal, and the editor agrees, then the paper might be rejected after review. And so then the author might have gone through this whole long process of waiting for the paper to be reviewed only to have it rejected. The editor might also say this isn't quite appropriate for our journal, but it might be more appropriate for the sister journal of ours, which might be like a tier down in its kind of like status. And so then it might get published off to one of those. And so you might see something like Nature, which is the main article, and then you have Nature Communications, Nature Advances, Nature this, Nature that, and stuff like that. And so those kind of like sister journals are kind of like a tier down on the hierarchy. But papers can get passed down to them from people that submit to those kind of main journals, or people can submit directly to one of those sister journals. But those are kind of some of the fates that can occur for this paper, and sometimes these fates can take a really long time. And so in the process of doing all of that, what scientists might do, and they might actually be required to do this, or they might be restricted from doing this depending on the journal, is to submit to a preprint server. Something like bioRxiv, chemRxiv, medRxiv, arXiv. These are places where they can submit their manuscripts, so like the draft of their paper, before it's actually been through that peer review process. And in this way, other scientists can actually go and read their paper and, well, it's being reviewed. And this is great if scientists, say, are going to a conference, they want to get their results out to have something to direct people to, but it's still in the process of being peer reviewed. The scientists can also put it on their CV, and importantly, it just gets that information out to the community so that the community can make use of it for their own research, their own knowledge, that sort of thing. And so, especially during times of the COVID pandemic, preprint servers became increasingly important as scientists and doctors and things were posting data to these preprint servers, and that was then helping with the development of vaccines, therapeutics. All these great things were coming about because of these preprint servers. Putting it out on a preprint server also allows other scientists to kind of do an unofficial peer review. And so you might see, especially things on like social media, where authors are kind of commenting on other people's papers, as well as there are kind of comment sections that you can look at on the preprint server themselves, although typically things are more happening on other sites, but they link out to those sites as well. Often on things like Blue Sky, authors will do kind of little threads with explaining different key features of their article. However, there are kind of things that you need to be careful with preprint servers because they haven't gone through the peer review process. Now, the peer review process is far from perfect. There can be things like peer reviewers that have grudges against the authors or their competitors, although there's also things like when you submit your paper, you can say, please exclude these people from reviewing it because I don't think that they could be unbiased, or they're my competitors, I don't want them seeing my data, those sorts of things. But basically, the peer review might not be perfect. The peer reviewer might not be able to catch all the mistakes. There could be things like this. And so you always want to think critically, and peer review doesn't actually mean that it's definitely legit, but at least it's gone through some sort of level of the review process, as opposed to the preprint servers, which basically just do some basic screening to make sure that it's not just like trash. And the papers that get through that initial screening then get posted on the preprint server. One of the great things about preprint servers, in addition to its speed, is that it's open access and it's free. So basically, open access means that anybody can read it for free. And so preprint servers are typically always open access. But some journals, a lot of journals, are actually paywalled, although a lot of them are changing to an open access model. So a paywall journal means that basically you have to pay in order to read the articles. So you have to have like a subscription to a journal, your library does, and then you have to access it through your library. And often this is going to be represented by like a padlock that's gray. And so that's going to indicate that you don't have access to this paper. And then, or that if you don't have access to the journal, you don't have access to this paper. Open access is often going to be like an open padlock, and it's going to be green, and that's going to indicate that anybody can read this paper freely. Now, what might surprise you is that scientists often have to pay to have their papers be open access. And so this surprised me when I first learned that, like in general, authors actually pay to have their papers published. And this leads to predatory journal practices where journals, like really bad journals, will just publish trash and collect money from authors. And so you can actually look at like lists of predatory journals, and I'm not going to go into that right now. But the basic thing is that scientists have to pay for their papers to be published, and typically they have to pay more for their paper to be published open access. Now, sometimes authors publish versions of their paper, such as in preprints, which are always freely available, or on things like Research Square, and there could be free versions of papers online, even if they're not free at the journal website. And so there's this tool I use called Unpaywall, which has a browser extension that actually sticks a little tab on the side of my browser when I'm like looking at the page of an article, and it'll show me whether a paper has an open access version. And if it does, then I can click on that and it'll take me to the PDF version of it that's actually like legal. There's also things that are like Sci-Hub, where you can get versions of papers that aren't always free. I mean, they're not always legal, but they are always free. And sometimes the server goes down because they're not always legal. But that is something that you might hear about. And I'm not directing you to it, but I'm informing you about it. But the Unpaywall definitely is a legit site. They have legal versions. And so the bioRxiv, those archive sites, however, those preprint servers are going to be those freely accessible. And these days too, now they have kind of full text versions that are actually formatted. In the early days, you would only have the PDFs, and then it was a kind of a pain. When authors first submit the papers, they're typically PDFs, but then within like a few days or something, then they get converted to the formatted form where you can actually scroll through it just like you would on a journal article's website. The version that you see in the preprint might not be the same as the version that you see published. The version that you see published might have additional experiments. It might have some typos corrected. And so you still want to be cautious with the preprints. Sometimes scientists will actually post additional versions of their preprints. So you might have different versions of the preprints, and so you can look at the versioning. And then when the paper gets published, if it gets published, they don't always get published, but if the paper gets published, then the preprint server will actually put a link to the published version. It'll say like now published and blah, blah, blah. And so then you can go and find that paper on the publisher site. And so again, authors will sometimes submit to the bioRxiv or to one of these archives before they submit their paper to a journal, at the same time as they submit their paper to a journal, or without ever submitting the paper to a journal. But the preprint process is going to be a lot quicker because it's not going through that peer review process. And although we call it preprint, most papers these days are online anyway, so I'm guessing that the term preprint will still stick though.